Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The night everything changed started like any other sleepover at Jenna's place. I was 16 then, and her house had become my second home over the years we'd been friends. Her parents lived in one of those middle-class neighborhoods where the streets were lined with oak trees and everyone knew each other's business. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids could walk home alone after dark without anyone batting an eye. Jenna's mom had made us her famous chocolate chip cookies before they left for their anniversary dinner, and her dad had given us the usual lecture about not answering the door for strangers. We rolled our eyes and promised to be good, already planning our night of horror movies and gossip sessions that would keep us awake until sunrise. The house always felt different when it was just the two of us. Bigger somehow, with all those empty rooms and the way sound seemed to travel differently through the hallways. Jenna's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the front yard and the quiet street below. We had claimed the living room as our headquarters for the night, spreading blankets and pillows across the hardwood floor and setting up our laptop for the movie marathon we'd been planning all week. The kitchen was stocked with enough snacks to feed a small army, and we had that giddy feeling that comes with having the whole house to ourselves. Neither of us had any idea that someone might be watching, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Around midnight, after we'd already watched 2 movies and demolished half the snacks, Jenna got this brilliant idea to post on Instagram. She was always more adventurous with social media than I was, the type who would share every random thought or moment. "Let's tell everyone how bored we are," she said, already typing on her phone with that mischievous grin I knew meant trouble. The post was simple enough, just a picture of us surrounded by empty candy wrappers with the caption, "Bored and alone LOL." At the time, it seemed harmless, maybe even funny. We were just 2 teenagers being dramatic about our perfectly normal Friday night. But as I watched her hit the share button, I had this tiny moment of hesitation, like maybe broadcasting our situation to the entire world wasn't the smartest idea. The response was immediate and typical. Friends commenting with laughing emojis, a few people suggesting we should have invited them over, the usual social media chatter. We scrolled through the comments, laughing at the responses and feeling popular, in that shallow way teenagers do when their posts get attention. Jenna kept refreshing the page, watching the likes pile up and reading the comments out loud in dramatic voices. We were completely absorbed in our phones, which is probably why we didn't notice the car that had started making slow passes by the house. The street was usually dead quiet after 10, with most of the neighbors already asleep and their windows dark. But someone was out there, circling the block, taking note of the house where 2 girls had just announced to the world that they were home alone. It was about 20 minutes later when we heard the car pull into the driveway. The sound of tires on gravel made us both look up from our phones, and Jenna immediately went to the front window to peer through the curtains. "Are your parents coming home early?" I asked, but she shook her head looking confused. The car was a dark sedan, nothing like her dad's silver SUV, and it was just sitting there with the engine running. We could see the outline of a man behind the wheel, but he wasn't getting out. He just sat there for what felt like forever, and we started to get that uncomfortable feeling in our stomachs. Then the car door slammed and we heard footsteps on the walkway, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to echo in the quiet night air. The doorbell rang 3 times in quick succession, sharp and insistent. We both jumped, and Jenna grabbed my arm instinctively. "Should we answer it?" she whispered, but I shook my head immediately. Her parents hadn't mentioned expecting anyone, and it was past midnight on a Friday. Normal people don't just show up at someone's house at this hour without calling first. We crept closer to the front door, trying to be as quiet as possible, and that's when we heard his voice for the first time. It was muffled through the door, but we could make out the words clearly. "I'm here to pick up Jenna for her ride." The way he said it was so casual, so matter-of-fact, like this was completely normal. But neither of us had ordered any kind of ride, and we definitely hadn't told anyone named Jenna to expect a pickup. Jenna looked at me with wide eyes, and I could see the confusion and growing fear on her face. "I didn't call anyone," she mouthed silently, and I believed her completely. We stood there in the dark hallway, afraid to move or make a sound, hoping he would just go away. But then he spoke again, louder this time. "Jenna, I know you're in there. Your ride is here." His voice had this weird quality to it, like he was trying too hard to sound friendly and professional. There was something underneath it that made my skin crawl, something that didn't match the words he was saying. The doorbell rang again, followed by a series of knocks that grew progressively louder and more demanding. We could hear him shifting his weight on the porch, the boards creaking under his feet as he moved around. Then came the sound that made us both panic, the distinct rattle of the door handle being turned. He was actually trying to get inside. The lock held, thank God, but the fact that he would even attempt it sent us into full alert mode. "Who sent you?" Jenna called out, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound calm. There was a pause, and then he said, "Your friend called for a pickup, said you needed a ride." But when she asked which friend, he couldn't give her a name. He just kept repeating that someone had called, that he was there to pick up Jenna and that she needed to come outside. The whole thing was becoming more bizarre and terrifying by the minute. We both knew this wasn't a legitimate ride service. No real driver would be this persistent or refuse to provide details about who had requested the pickup. When he realized we weren't going to open the door, things took a turn for the worse. We heard his footsteps move away from the front entrance, and for a moment, we thought maybe he was giving up and leaving. But then we heard him walking around the side of the house, his shoes crunching on the gravel pathway that led to the backyard. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We followed the sound of his movement from inside, creeping through the house and trying to track where he was going. The living room had large windows that faced the side yard, and we could see his silhouette moving past them in the darkness. He was systematically checking each window, and then we heard the most terrifying sound, a gentle but persistent tapping on the glass. The tapping followed a pattern, like he was testing each window to see if any of them were unlocked. Tap, tap, tap on the living room window. Then he moved to the kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. Then the dining room. Each time the sound was soft but deliberate, like he was trying not to wake the neighbors but still determined to find a way inside. We were both trembling now, clutching each other and trying to stay out of sight. The worst part was how methodical he was being. This wasn't some random drunk person or confused delivery driver. This was someone who had a plan, someone who wasn't going to give up easily. When he reached the back door, we heard him try the handle there too, rattling it just like he had done with the front door. That's when we finally snapped out of our paralysis and realized we needed to call for help. Jenna grabbed her phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers while I kept watch at the window. I could see him moving around to the other side of the house now, continuing his systematic inspection of every possible entry point. The dispatcher answered immediately, and Jenna whispered frantically into the phone, explaining that a strange man was trying to break into the house and claiming he was there to pick someone up for a ride that was never requested. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line and assured us that police were being dispatched to our location. But even as we waited, we could still hear him out there, moving around the house like he was conducting some kind of security assessment. At one point, he came back to the front door and rang the bell again, calling out, "Jenna," in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, their sirens wailing as they pulled into the driveway. But by then, he was gone. We heard his car engine start up and the screech of tires as he sped away into the night. The officers searched the property and took our statements, but there wasn't much they could do without a license plate number or a clear description of the suspect. They told us we had done the right thing by not opening the door and assured us they would increase patrols in the neighborhood. 2 days later, we found out why this whole thing had happened. The same man was arrested just a few blocks away for attempting to abduct another teenage girl, using the exact same story, claiming he was there to pick her up for a ride that nobody had requested. Turns out, he had been monitoring social media posts from local teenagers, looking for opportunities just like the one we had unknowingly provided him. That Instagram post about being bored and alone had been like sending him an invitation. We never posted anything like that again. The summer I turned 17. I spent 2 weeks at my cousin Tyler's place while his parents were away on some business trip. His house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Michigan, one of those neighborhoods where everyone waters their lawn at exactly the same time, and the biggest excitement is usually someone's garbage can rolling into the street. Tyler and I had been up most of the night playing this new racing game, energy drinks and pizza boxes scattered around his living room, like we were preparing for some kind of apocalypse. The house felt different with just the two of us there. Bigger somehow, with all these shadows in the corners that I'd never noticed before. We'd been completely absorbed in our game when the knocking started, just 3 soft taps that barely registered over the sound of our controllers clicking. At first, neither of us moved. It was past midnight, and in a neighborhood like Tyler's, people didn't just show up unannounced at that hour. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and Tyler finally paused the game and looked at me with this confused expression. "Who the hell would be here right now?" he whispered, like whoever was outside might hear us through the thick front door. I shrugged and followed him to the entryway, both of us suddenly aware of how loud our footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor. Tyler flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole, his body language immediately shifting from confused to cautious. "It's some girl," he said quietly, stepping back from the door. "She looks young, maybe 16 or something." The knocking started again, and this time we could hear a voice, soft, almost pleading, asking if anyone was home. Tyler cracked the door open just enough to talk through the chain lock, and I could see her from where I stood behind him. She had this wild, curly red hair that caught the porch light in a way that made it almost glow, and she was wearing what looked like a oversized flannel shirt that hung off her small frame. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with these huge green eyes that seemed too big for her head. "I'm really sorry to bother you guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but my car broke down about a mile from here and my phone died. Could I maybe use yours to call someone?" There was something about the way she spoke, too polite, too rehearsed, that made me uncomfortable. Tyler glanced back at me and I could see he was having the same thoughts. The girl shifted her weight from foot to foot, and I noticed she kept glancing past us into the house like she was trying to see the layout or something. "There's a gas station about half a mile down the main road," Tyler said through the gap in the door. "They're open 24 hours and they've got a payphone outside." The girl's expression changed for just a split second, a flash of something that wasn't quite disappointment, but wasn't surprise either. It was like she'd been expecting that answer. "Oh, I don't have any change for a payphone," she said, her voice taking on this slightly whiny quality. "And it's really dark out there. I'm kind of scared to walk alone." She took a small step closer to the door, and I noticed her feet were bare, which struck me as odd given that it was probably 50 degrees outside. Tyler hesitated, and I could see him wrestling with whether to help her or not. "Maybe try the Hendersons next door," he finally said, pointing to the house on our left. "They've got teenagers too, they might still be up." The girl nodded, but she didn't move away from our door right away. Instead, she stood there for another few seconds, just staring at us with those unsettling green eyes. After she finally walked away, Tyler closed the door and we both stood there for a moment, not saying anything. There was this weird energy in the air, like when you know a storm is coming but you can't see the clouds yet. "That was strange," Tyler finally said, but he was already heading back toward the living room. I followed him, but something kept nagging at me. The way she'd looked at us, the bare feet, the rehearsed quality of her voice. It all felt wrong somehow. We picked up our controllers and tried to get back into the game, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes I'd glance toward the front windows, expecting to see her face pressed against the glass, or something equally disturbing. Tyler seemed to have forgotten about her completely, already back to trash-talking me about my driving skills in the game. The house felt different now, though, less safe, more exposed. Even with all the lights on and the familiar sounds of the game, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. About 20 minutes later, I got up to grab another energy drink from the kitchen, and that's when I decided to check the side window that faced the Hendersons' house. I wanted to see if she'd actually gone there, or if she'd just disappeared into the night. The window was in Tyler's dad's office, and I had to move some papers aside to get a clear view. What I saw made my entire body tense up in a way I'd never experienced before. The girl was there, but she wasn't at the Hendersons' door. She was crouched down behind their big oak tree, maybe 15 feet from our house, and she was whispering to something in the darkness. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but her mouth was moving rapidly, and she kept gesturing toward our house with her hands. The way she was positioned, it was clear she'd been watching us the whole time. I pressed myself closer to the glass, trying to see what or who she was talking to, and that's when I saw the shadows moving in the bushes around her. There were at least 2 other people hiding in the landscaping, maybe more. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I watched as one of the shadows shifted, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like a man in dark clothing, probably in his 20s, with something metallic in his hand. The girl kept whispering and pointing, and I realized she was giving them information about our house, probably telling them about the layout she'd tried to scope out when she was at our door. Another figure emerged slightly from behind the Hendersons' garbage cans, and I could see it was another man, this one shorter and stockier than the first. They were all communicating in these hushed tones, but their body language was aggressive, predatory. The girl stood up and pointed directly at the side window where I was standing, and for a terrifying moment, I thought she'd seen me. But then she pointed to a different window, the kitchen window, and I realized she was mapping out the house for them. I backed away from the window as quietly as I could and practically ran back to the living room. Tyler was still absorbed in the game, completely oblivious to what was happening outside. "Tyler," I whispered urgently, "we need to turn off all the lights right now." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What? Why? We're in the middle of a race." I grabbed the controller out of his hands and turned off the TV, plunging the room into darkness. "That girl isn't gone," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "She's outside with at least 2 other people, and they're watching the house." Tyler's expression immediately changed from annoyed to alarmed. "Are you serious?" he asked, and I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. I told him everything I'd seen: the girl crouched behind the tree, the men in the bushes, the way she'd been pointing at our windows. As I spoke, Tyler's face went pale, and he started moving toward the front door to check the locks. We spent the next few minutes crawling from window to window, trying to get a better view of what was happening outside without being seen. The girl and her companions had moved positions, and now they seemed to be checking different sides of the house. At one point, I saw the shorter man trying the back gate, testing whether it was locked. The girl had moved to the front yard and was standing near the mailbox, probably acting as a lookout. The third figure, the one with the metallic object, was doing something near Tyler's dad's car in the driveway. "We need to call the police," I whispered. But Tyler reminded me that his parents had taken the landline phone with them, and both our cell phones were dead from the all-night gaming session. We were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a house that suddenly felt like a glass cage. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet sounded like thunder, and every shadow outside seemed to be moving closer to the windows. The situation escalated when we heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying the front door handle. Tyler and I were huddled in the hallway, and we both went completely still when we heard that metallic click of the handle being turned slowly, deliberately. The door held, thank God Tyler had remembered to lock it after the girl left, but then we heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of the house. They were testing every possible entry point, and the methodical way they were doing it made it clear this wasn't some random break-in attempt. These people had planned this, and the girl had been their scout. I could hear muffled voices outside the kitchen window, and then the sound of something scraping against the glass. Tyler grabbed my arm so hard I thought he might leave bruises, and we both held our breath as we listened to them trying to find a way in. The scraping stopped, and for a moment everything was silent except for the sound of our own breathing. Then we heard the girl's voice again, clearer this time, coming from right outside the living room window. "I know you're in there," she called out in a sing-song voice that was completely different from the helpless tone she'd used at the door. "You should have just let me use your phone." There was something deeply unsettling about the way she said it. Not angry, but almost playful, like this was all just a game to her. Tyler and I exchanged terrified glances, and I could see the same thought in his eyes that was running through my mind. How had we been so stupid? The knocking had been a setup from the beginning, and we'd fallen for it completely. "We just want to come in and look around," the girl continued, her voice moving along the window as she walked. "We're not going to hurt you. We just need a few things." But the way she said it with that eerie cheerfulness made it clear that whatever they wanted, it wasn't going to end well for us. I remembered Tyler's dad kept a baseball bat in the hall closet, and I whispered this to Tyler, who nodded and started crawling toward it. While he was getting the bat, I tried to think of any other options we might have. The Hendersons' house was close enough that we could probably make it there if we ran, but we'd have to go out the back door and climb over the fence, and there was no guarantee these people wouldn't catch us in the yard. Plus, we had no idea how many of them there actually were. I'd seen 3, but there could have been more hiding in places I couldn't see from the windows. Tyler came back with the bat and also handed me a heavy flashlight he'd found in the closet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We could hear the people outside moving around again, and this time they seemed to be focusing on the back of the house. The girl's voice had stopped, which somehow made everything even more terrifying. That's when Tyler remembered something that probably saved our lives. His dad had installed one of those fancy security systems the year before, complete with cameras and a panic button that connected directly to the police station. The control panel was in the master bedroom upstairs, and Tyler had watched his dad use it dozens of times. We made our way up the stairs as quietly as possible, every step seeming to echo through the house despite our efforts to be silent. The security system was more complicated than Tyler had expected, but after a few tense minutes of trying different combinations, he managed to activate the cameras. We could see them on the small monitor. 4 people total, all wearing dark clothes, and they were definitely trying to break in. One of them had something that looked like a crowbar, and they were working on the back door. Tyler found the panic button and pressed it, and immediately we heard a piercing alarm start blaring throughout the house. The people outside scattered like cockroaches when you turn on a light, and within what felt like seconds, they had disappeared into the night. We stayed upstairs, watching the empty yard on the security monitors, until the police arrived about 10 minutes later. When the cops showed up, they took our statement and reviewed the security footage with us. The cameras had captured clear images of all 4 suspects, including the red-haired girl who had seemed so innocent at our door. Officer Jenkins, the lead detective, told us this wasn't the first time they'd seen this particular group. Apparently, they'd been hitting houses in suburban neighborhoods for months, always using the same strategy. The girl would pose as someone in distress to scout the house and identify which homes had young people alone, older residents, or other easy targets. Then she'd relay information to her accomplices about entry points, how many people were inside, and whether there were any security measures. What made our case different was that we had such clear footage of their faces. The police were able to identify 3 of the 4 suspects within a week, and they arrested them at a motel about 40 miles away. They found stolen electronics, jewelry, and even prescription drugs from at least a dozen different houses. The girl turned out to be named Katie Brennan, and she was actually 19, not 16 like we'd thought. She'd been working with these guys for almost a year, and according to the police, she was really good at reading people and knowing exactly what kind of story would get her close to a house. The detective said if we'd opened that door and let her inside, things could have gone very differently. They'd found zip ties and duct tape in the suspect's car, which suggested they weren't just planning to rob houses. All four of them eventually got convicted on multiple charges of breaking and entering, attempted robbery, and conspiracy. Katie got the longest sentence because she was considered the ringleader. To this day, I never answer my door after dark unless I'm absolutely certain I know who's on the other side. And I always make sure my phone is charged. I need to share what happened to me when I was 16 because it still haunts me to this day. It was October 2019, and I was staying the weekend at my childhood friend Mia's place while her parents were visiting her grandparents in Vermont. We'd been best friends since elementary school, but we didn't get to hang out as much anymore since she moved to this suburban townhouse development, about 20 minutes from my neighborhood. The place was nice but kind of isolated. One of those cookie-cutter communities where all the houses look the same, and there's barely any street lighting. Mia had been begging me to come over for a sleepover like old times, and when her parents said they'd be gone for the weekend, I jumped at the chance. I remember being excited because we were finally going to binge-watch that new Netflix series everyone was talking about and catch up on all the drama from school. The first day was perfect. We made way too much popcorn, painted each other's nails this awful shade of purple that Mia swore was trendy, and spent hours scrolling through TikTok and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Her townhouse had this open floor plan where the kitchen connected to the living room, and we'd spread out all our snacks and blankets like we were camping indoors. The place had 3 bedrooms upstairs, but since it was just the 2 of us, we decided to crash in her room, which had twin beds separated by this small nightstand with a lamp that cast these weird shadows on the walls. Around 11 that night, we took a bunch of selfies to post on Instagram. Typical teenage stuff, making duck faces and peace signs. We were being loud and silly, probably disturbing the neighbors, but we didn't care. Everything felt normal and safe. Just 2 best friends having the kind of sleepover we used to have all the time when we were younger. We finally went to bed around midnight, but I've always been a light sleeper, especially in unfamiliar places. The townhouse made all these settling noises that kept me tossing and turning, creaking floorboards, the furnace kicking on and off, random pops and clicks that old houses make. Mia was out cold within minutes, breathing deeply with her back turned to me, completely unbothered by any of the sounds. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I remember was this sharp noise jolting me awake. It was around 3 a.m., according to the digital clock on the nightstand, and the house was completely dark, except for the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the bedroom window. At first I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, but then I heard it again. The distinct sound of a door closing downstairs, not slamming but that soft click you make when you're trying to be quiet. My heart started racing immediately. I shook Mia's shoulder, whispering her name urgently until she groaned and rolled over to face me. Her eyes were barely open, and she had that annoyed expression people get when you wake them up from deep sleep. When I told her I heard a door close downstairs, she just mumbled something about it being the pipes and turned back over, but I knew what I heard. It wasn't pipes. It was definitely a door. The sound had come from the direction of the kitchen, near the back entrance where they kept the spare key under this fake rock by the patio steps. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any other sounds, but the house had gone completely silent again. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak made me jump, and I couldn't shake this feeling that someone was down there, maybe waiting for us to fall back asleep. The next morning, Mia acted like nothing had happened. She was making pancakes and humming some song while I sat at the kitchen table, still jumpy from the night before. I kept glancing toward the back door, checking if anything looked different or out of place, but everything seemed normal. When I brought up the door sound again, she just rolled her eyes and said the townhouse was new construction and still settling. I wanted to believe her, but something kept nagging at me. While she was flipping pancakes, I pulled out my phone to delete some of the blurry selfies we'd taken the night before. We'd probably taken like 50 trying to get the perfect shot. That's when I saw it. In one of the photos, there was this figure in the background, barely visible but definitely there. A man, blurry and dark, standing in the hallway behind us. Neither of us had seen him when we took the picture, and we definitely hadn't invited anyone over. I called Mia over immediately, my voice probably shaking more than I wanted it to. She looked at the photo, squinting at the screen, and then just shrugged it off as a shadow or maybe the lamp creating some weird reflection. But I knew shadows, and this wasn't one. The figure had a distinctly human shape, shoulders, a head, what looked like a hood pulled up. I zoomed in as much as I could, but the image quality was too poor to make out any details. What terrified me most was that we'd been completely oblivious to someone being in the house with us. We'd been laughing, taking pictures, being loud and carefree while this person was just standing there watching us. Mia kept insisting it was nothing, but I could see in her eyes that she was starting to get nervous too. She suggested we go to the mall to distract ourselves, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure lurking in the background of our innocent sleepover photo. That evening, we tried to stick to our original plan of watching movies and eating junk food, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Every little sound made both of us jump, and we kept the living room lights on even though it was getting late. Around 10 o'clock, we decided to call it a night and headed upstairs to Mia's room. I suggested we push the beds together and sleep in the same one, which she agreed to without question. I think she was more spooked than she wanted to admit. We turned off the main light, but left the small lamp on the nightstand burning, casting that same eerie glow across the room. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan the house made, while Mia tossed and turned beside me. The photo kept flashing in my mind, that hooded figure standing so still, so silent, just watching us from the shadows. Around midnight, I heard Mia's breathing become deep and even, but sleep was impossible for me. I kept thinking about that door sound from the night before, wondering if whoever had been in the house was still somewhere nearby. The bedroom window faced the neighbor's house, and occasionally I'd see car headlights sweep across the walls as someone drove down the street. But then I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. There was movement outside that wasn't from any car. At first I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the wind, but as I watched more carefully, I realized it was too deliberate, too purposeful. There was definitely something moving around outside, and it seemed to be getting closer to our window. I wanted to wake Mia, but part of me hoped I was just being paranoid after everything that had happened. Then I saw him, a figure in dark clothing with a hood pulled up, standing perfectly still on the neighbor's roof, directly facing our bedroom window. The man wasn't moving at all, just standing there like a statue, but I could feel his eyes on us even though I couldn't see his face in the darkness. He was maybe 30 feet away, positioned on the single-story section of the neighbor's roof, where their garage connected to their house. What made it even more terrifying was how he'd gotten up there. Their yard was completely fenced in, and you'd have to climb over or find another way in. My whole body went rigid with fear, and I couldn't even breathe properly. I kept hoping he'd move away or that I was imagining things, but he just stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and shook Mia awake, whispering frantically that there was someone outside watching us. She sat up immediately, more alert this time, and when she looked toward the window, I saw her face go completely pale. She saw him too. We both lay there frozen, not knowing what to do. Mia whispered that we should call the police, but her phone was downstairs in the kitchen, and mine was almost dead. Neither of us wanted to get up and turn our backs on the window, and we were terrified that any movement might provoke him somehow. The man continued to stand there, completely still, like he was waiting for something. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, Mia finally worked up the courage to crawl to the floor and grab her laptop from under the bed. She was shaking so badly she could barely type, but she managed to get online and find the non-emergency police number. When she called, her voice was barely above a whisper as she explained the situation. The dispatcher told us to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and that officers would be there within 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like the longest of my life, and the whole time that hooded figure never moved an inch from his position on the roof. When we finally heard the police cars pull up, their red and blue lights flooding the bedroom, the man was gone, just vanished like he'd never been there at all. 2 officers came to the front door and we rushed downstairs to let them in, both of us talking at once and probably sounding hysterical. They were professional, but I could tell they thought we were just scared teenagers letting our imaginations run wild. Officer Williams, the older one, walked around the perimeter of the house with his flashlight, while his partner asked us questions about what we'd seen. When Williams came back inside, his expression had changed completely. He told us they'd found something we needed to see and led us to the downstairs bathroom window. The screen had been sliced open from the outside, not torn or damaged accidentally, but cut in a clean line along the bottom edge, just wide enough for someone to reach through and unlock the window. The officers took our statements and photos of the damaged screen, and Williams explained that this was likely how the intruder had been getting into the house. The bathroom window faced the backyard and was hidden from the street, making it the perfect entry point. They found footprints in the mud below the window and disturbed leaves on the neighbor's roof, where we'd seen the man standing. Williams said this appeared to be someone who had been watching the house, probably knew the parents were away, and had been coming and going for at least a couple of nights. The thought that he'd been in the house while we were sleeping, maybe even the night before when I heard that door, still gives me nightmares. They increased patrols in the area for the next few weeks, and Mia's parents came home early after we called them. We never found out who the man was, but the break-ins stopped after that night. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching some other house, waiting for the right moment to slip inside and stand in the shadows while people sleep, completely unaware of his presence. Growing up in a small town in North Carolina, weekends were pretty uneventful. That particular Saturday felt like any other, quiet, warm, and dragging like most summer nights. I was staying over at my friend Brooke's place with 2 other girls we knew from school, Paige and Lauren. Brooke's parents had gone out of town for a wedding, so we had the house to ourselves. We were all 15 back then, stuck in that awkward space between feeling invincible and having no idea how the world really worked. We'd spent the early evening eating junk food, watching horror movies we pretended didn't scare us, and daring each other to do stupid things. Typical sleepover stuff. But what happened that night still makes it hard for me to fall asleep with the lights off. Next door to Brooke's house was a vacation home that belonged to a man named Mr. Patterson. He was hardly ever around, only showing up maybe twice a year with his wife, usually during the holidays. The house sat dark and untouched most of the time, and over the months, it became this sort of mysterious magnet for our boredom. We'd talk about it like kids talk about haunted houses, just vague, spooky stories we made up to entertain ourselves. That night, for reasons I still don't fully understand, someone, maybe Lauren, suggested we sneak over there. Not to break anything, not to steal, just to peek inside and maybe take a dumb video for Snapchat. We thought we'd be in and out in 10 minutes. No one would ever know. We slipped out through Brooke's backyard around 1 in the morning. The gate between the 2 houses wasn't even locked. I remember that detail clearly because I expected it to be. The grass was overgrown, and the air felt heavy in that way it sometimes does when there's a storm coming, though the forecast had been clear. Brooke had a little flashlight app on her phone, and we used it to guide us along the back path toward the sliding glass door. It was unlocked, too. That should have been our first red flag, but we were too caught up in the thrill of doing something we weren't supposed to. I remember whispering, half laughing, that maybe Patterson forgot to lock up before leaving. Nobody questioned it. We stepped inside. The interior smelled strange. Not like dust or mildew. More like something had been sealed inside for too long. The furniture was covered in sheets, but they didn't look like they'd been untouched. One of the armchairs had a deep indent, like someone had been sitting there recently. There was a coffee mug on the kitchen counter with dry residue in the bottom. Paige pointed out an empty ramen cup in the trash. Still, we joked nervously and kept walking. It didn't hit us that we weren't alone until we reached the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open, and the first thing I saw inside was a pile of clothes, men's clothes, neatly folded on the bed, and a spiral-bound notebook lying open on the floor. At first, we thought maybe Patterson had let someone stay there, maybe a cousin or something. But the more we looked around that room, the more that theory stopped making sense. The air in there felt warmer, stale, like someone had just stepped out. There was a half-full water bottle on the nightstand, a pair of sneakers under the bed, and a phone charger still plugged into the wall. None of us touched anything at first. It was Lauren who eventually picked up the notebook from the floor, flipping through it. She stopped on one of the pages, looked confused, then handed it to me without saying anything. What I saw made my mouth go dry. There were pages, dozens of them, filled with the same name written over and over again in cramped handwriting. Not random names. Mine. First name, last name, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. It wasn't just scribbled mindlessly either. Some lines had little notes next to them, things like Thursday Pongs alone or window unlocked. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Brooke asked me what it said, and I just handed it over without a word. Watching her expression shift from confusion to something more serious is one of those moments that plays in my head like a loop. None of us were laughing anymore. That was the turning point, when the adrenaline turned into something colder. We all backed out of the room together, not really talking, just moving. Lauren kept saying we needed to go back, that we had seen enough. I think she was the first one to really process how wrong all of it felt. Paige kept glancing behind us like she expected someone to come out of the shadows. We shut the sliding door behind us quietly and sprinted through the yard without looking back. Once we got inside Brooke's house, we locked every door and window, turned off all the lights, and huddled in her room with our phones out. That was when Brooke noticed something on her bedroom wall, just above her dresser, near the corner where her bookshelf met the ceiling. It was a tiny black square. Too small to be a smoke detector, too perfectly placed to be random. She climbed up on a chair and pulled it off the wall. It was a camera, one of those cheap ones you can order online, the kind you wouldn't even notice if you weren't looking for it. It was angled directly at her bed. None of us said anything. We just stared at each other. Lauren went pale and said, "Check the rest of the house." What followed was the most terrifying hour of my life. We found 3 more hidden cameras, all tucked into corners. One in the hallway, one in the downstairs living room, and another, pointed at the front door. No one really knew what to do at first. We were just 4 teenage girls in a locked house, holding hidden cameras we hadn't put there, and trying to convince ourselves this was all some weird misunderstanding. Brooke called her older brother, who was in college 2 towns over, and he told her to hang up and call the cops immediately. We did. 2 officers showed up about 30 minutes later, and even though we tried to act calm, I could feel how shaky the air in the room had gotten. Brooke explained everything, starting from the sleepover to the notebook next door. The officers didn't say much at first, but when they found the camera in the living room, their entire energy shifted. They took everything seriously after that. One of them asked if we could show them the neighbor's house, so we walked them next door while they cleared each room. When they stepped into the guest room, I could tell they hadn't been expecting to find the things we described, but it was all still there. One of the cops found a sleeping bag stuffed into the closet, along with some snacks, a pair of binoculars, and more notebooks, some with other names in them. Paige started crying when she saw one of the entries said, "Friday, Ishai's all 4. The cop radioed something in and told us to go wait back at Brooke's. Within an hour, 2 more cars pulled up, and we had to give statements in her kitchen until almost sunrise. Turns out someone had been living in that house. Not Patterson, not a relative. Some guy in his late 30s who had absolutely no connection to the neighborhood. He'd apparently been squatting there for weeks, maybe longer, and using the place as a base. The worst part? He'd installed cameras not just in the house he was staying in, but in Brooke's house too. Police found footage on an SD card that showed us eating dinner, sleeping, brushing our teeth. There was even a short clip of us getting ready in our pajamas the night we went over there. That's when it hit all of us. He had been watching us the whole time. Not just that night, for days. Maybe weeks. I still think about it more than I probably should. The man was arrested, but the footage, the notebooks with our names, the fact that someone was just there, right next to us, without any of us knowing, it messed with my head in a way I can't really explain. Brooke moved not long after. Her parents said it was for work, but we all knew why. I don't sleep over at anyone's house anymore, and I always check the corners of every room I walk into. People think those little creepy neighbor stories are just urban legends. I'm telling you they're not. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just someone watching, waiting, right next door. Uncle Pete's farmhouse had always been our escape from the regular world. I was 14 that July in 2017, and my cousin Danny was just turned 12 when we found ourselves spending the weekend at his place again. The old two-story house sat on about 3 acres of semi-rural land, surrounded by thick oak trees and overgrown fields that stretched toward the distant neighbor's property. Uncle Pete was one of those laid-back adults who let us stay up late playing his old Xbox and raiding his pantry for snacks our parents would never buy. His property had this charm to it: a sprawling vegetable garden out back, a fire pit surrounded by mismatched lawn chairs, and this weathered wooden shed that housed his collection of rusty tools and lawn equipment. That particular weekend felt different, though, mainly because our parents had driven into town for some special evening service at their church, leaving us with the usual warnings about behaving ourselves and not touching anything important. Danny had this nervous energy that always seemed to kick in after dark, especially when we were somewhere other than home. Around 9:30 that night, we'd settled into the living room with our controllers and a bag of chips, the blue glow from the TV casting weird shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Uncle Pete had left us with his cell number and enough pizza money to feed a small army, but the house felt enormous and too quiet without any adults around. The central air wasn't working properly, so we'd opened most of the windows to let in the summer breeze, and every little sound from outside seemed amplified. Crickets chirping, branches creaking, the occasional car passing on the distant road. Danny kept pausing the game to listen to noises that I couldn't even hear, his head tilted like a dog trying to identify some far-off sound. I kept telling him to relax, that it was just the normal sounds of being out in the country, but he had this expression on his face like he was waiting for something to happen. It was around 10:15 when Danny suddenly stood up and walked toward the back window in the kitchen. The house had this open floor plan where you could see from the living room straight through to the kitchen, and the big window above the sink gave a perfect view of the backyard. I was in the middle of a particularly intense level when I heard him call my name in this weird, strained voice. When I didn't respond immediately, he called again, more urgently this time. I paused the game and joined him at the window, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray cat rummaging through Uncle Pete's garbage cans. Instead, Danny was staring out at the area behind the tool shed, his face pressed against the glass like he was trying to get a better angle on whatever had caught his attention. The backyard was dimly lit by the porch light, creating these long shadows that stretched across the grass and made everything beyond about 20 feet look like indistinct shapes. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The shed stood about 40 yards from the house, its dark wooden walls blending into the tree line that marked the edge of Uncle Pete's property. But then Danny grabbed my arm and pointed toward the left side of the structure, where the shadows seemed thicker. That's when I saw him, a figure standing perfectly still in the narrow space between the shed and the old oak tree that grew behind it. The person was just standing there, not moving, not doing anything, just existing in that dark gap like a statue. From our distance, I could make out that it was definitely a man, probably average height, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. What made my chest tighten was the way he was positioned, Not like someone who had just walked over there, but like he'd been standing in that exact spot for a while, completely motionless. Danny whispered that he'd been watching the guy for at least 5 minutes, and in all that time, the man hadn't shifted his weight, adjusted his position, or moved so much as his head. We turned off all the lights in the kitchen and living room, plunging the house into darkness so we could observe without being seen. The man remained in the same position, his silhouette barely visible against the darker background of trees. I suggested maybe it was just Uncle Pete's neighbor checking on something, but Danny shook his head and reminded me that the nearest house was at least a quarter-mile away through dense woods. Besides, what kind of normal person would stand behind someone else's shed in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? We watched him for another 10 minutes, our faces pressed against the cool glass, and he didn't move an inch. It was like watching a mannequin that someone had placed in the yard as a prank, except this mannequin was breathing and had the unmistakable posture of a living person. The longer we stared, the more unnatural his stillness became, like he was deliberately trying not to be noticed while simultaneously positioning himself where he could observe the back of the house. Danny suggested we call Uncle Pete, but I argued that we'd probably get in trouble for being paranoid kids who couldn't handle one night alone. Instead, we decided to keep watching and see what the man would do. We took turns at the window, one of us keeping watch while the other grabbed snacks or used the bathroom. But we never left the post unmanned for more than a minute. During my shifts, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The man's clothing looked heavy, like a jacket or coat despite the warm July weather. His stance was perfectly straight, almost military-like, with his arms hanging at his sides. What bothered me most was that he seemed to be facing the house, not the woods or the road or anything else that might explain his presence. Every few minutes I'd convince myself that he'd moved slightly, turned his head or adjusted his feet, but then I'd blink and he'd be in the exact same position. Danny was getting more anxious as the minutes passed, constantly asking if we should do something, but neither of us could figure out what that something should be. An hour passed, then another 30 minutes. The man never moved. By now it was nearly midnight, and we'd been watching this stranger stand behind Uncle Pete's shed for over an hour and a half. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just confused about where he was. But none of those explanations could account for the absolute stillness, the way he seemed planted in that spot like he'd grown roots. Danny had started pacing around the kitchen, unable to sit still, while I maintained my position at the window. The man's presence had become this constant, oppressive weight in the back of my mind, like knowing there's a spider in your room but not being able to find it. I kept thinking about how exposed we were in the house, with all these windows and only 2 kids to deal with whatever this situation was becoming. The worst part was not knowing what he wanted or why he'd chosen that particular spot to stand in for so long. Around 12:30, I finally worked up the courage to suggest we call the police. Danny immediately agreed, probably relieved that I'd been the one to suggest it. We used Uncle Pete's landline, and I explained the situation to the dispatcher as calmly as I could manage. She asked if the man had threatened us or tried to approach the house, and when I said no, she seemed less concerned than I'd hoped. But she said she'd send a patrol car to check it out, and that we should stay inside and keep the doors locked until an officer arrived. After hanging up, we returned to our vigil at the window, but something had changed. The man was gone. The space behind the shed was empty, just shadows and the old oak tree swaying slightly in the breeze. We stared at that empty spot for another 10 minutes, both of us wondering if we'd imagined the whole thing, but we both knew what we'd seen. The man had been there for well over an hour, and now he'd vanished as silently as he'd appeared. The police officer arrived about 20 minutes later, a middle-aged guy named Officer Bailey who seemed genuinely concerned despite our ages. He took our statement seriously, writing down details about the man's appearance and how long he'd been standing there. Officer Bailey walked around the entire property with his flashlight, checking the shed, the tree line, and the areas where the man might have gone. When he came back to the house, He told us he'd found some disturbed grass behind the shed and what looked like footprints leading toward the woods, but no sign of the intruder himself. The officer explained that someone had definitely been there, confirming that we weren't just two kids with overactive imaginations. He suggested that maybe it was a transient looking for a place to sleep, or someone who'd gotten lost and was trying to figure out where they were. But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't quite believe his own explanations. The way someone stands perfectly still for over an hour isn't the behavior of someone who's lost or looking for shelter. Officer Bailey stayed with us until Uncle Pete got home around 1:30, and when our parents arrived shortly after, the whole story had to be told again. Uncle Pete was visibly shaken by what had happened, apologizing over and over for leaving us alone when something like this could occur. He walked the property again the next morning, finding the same disturbed areas that Officer Bailey had discovered, plus what looked like cigarette butts near the oak tree. Our parents cut the weekend short, and we were back home by Sunday afternoon, but the incident stayed with me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I could picture that motionless figure standing in the shadows, watching our house with an intensity that still made my skin crawl. Danny started having nightmares about it, waking up convinced that someone was standing outside his bedroom window. We both knew we'd encountered something that went beyond a simple trespassing incident, but we couldn't name what that something was. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that we got the real story. Officer Bailey called Uncle Pete with an update that made everything infinitely worse. The police had been investigating a series of break-ins in the area, and during their canvassing of neighbors, they'd discovered that the house directly behind Uncle Pete's property, through the woods, belonged to the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd been letting their adult nephew stay with them temporarily. The nephew, a man named Carl Hendricks, had been released from state prison just 2 months earlier after serving 8 years for aggravated assault and burglary. What made this information particularly disturbing was that Carl had apparently been staying with his aunt and uncle for several weeks without their knowledge of his criminal background, and on the night we'd seen him, he'd been missing from their house for over 6 hours. The Hendersons had assumed he'd gone for a walk, but when Officer Bailey interviewed them, they revealed that Carl had been asking detailed questions about the neighboring properties, including specific inquiries about Uncle Pete's house and whether anyone lived there full-time. The police had enough evidence to bring Carl in for questioning, but he disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a few belongings and no forwarding address. I used to spend almost every Friday night at my best friend Madison's place back in middle school. Her parents were pretty laid back, but also the kind that always kept the doors locked, even during the day. Their house was a small one-story in a quiet cul-de-sac in Nebraska. Nothing out of the ordinary, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and porch lights went off by 10. That night started like any other. Popcorn, nail polish, too much soda, and a stack of horror DVDs we weren't supposed to watch. Madison's room was at the back of the house, right next to the garden. Her bed was pushed up against the wall under a wide window that looked out into the yard, half covered by old white blinds. We stayed up later than we should have. At some point past midnight, the TV was still playing, but we were mostly just talking. I remember we were laughing about something dumb, something about a classmate who thought tapioca was a dog breed. That's when we heard the first tapping. It wasn't loud, just a sharp click like a fingernail against glass. Madison paused mid-sentence and we both turned to the window. It was windy that night and the tree out back was close enough to sometimes brush against the siding, so I joked, "It's probably just a branch." But it wasn't a branch. The wind had died down. There were no scraping sounds, just that deliberate soft tapping again, 3 times. Then silence. We sat frozen for a second, and Madison reached for the remote, lowering the TV volume until the room felt too quiet. The tapping didn't return. She leaned forward and pulled one of the blinds just slightly, just enough to see through without opening them all the way. What she did next scared me more than anything. She yanked her hand back like the cord burned her and whispered, "There's someone out there." I thought she was messing with me at first. I even smiled, waiting for the punchline. But then she grabbed my wrist hard and mouthed, "I'm not joking." I moved closer, my heart racing, and pulled the blinds down just a crack. And yeah, there he was. A man, mid-30s maybe, was crouched low, inches from the window. He wasn't standing. He was squatting like a runner before a race, perfectly still, with his face tilted just enough to look upward into the room. His expression wasn't angry or smiling, just blank. His head was shaved close, and his eyes didn't blink. What really got me was how calm he looked, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't move, he didn't flinch, he just stared, and we stared back, not even breathing. I remember every detail. The faded blue hoodie with a tear down one sleeve, the way his shoes were caked with dry mud, and the faint sound of his breathing fogging up the glass for just a second before he vanished into the dark. We scrambled backward off the bed like something might come through the window. Madison knocked over a can of Sprite and didn't even notice. Her hands were shaking and I could barely feel my legs. The porch light. Her dad had wired it to a switch in the hallway by the front door. We didn't say anything to each other. We just bolted. The hallway felt a mile long. Every shadow looked sharper, like the whole house had shifted slightly into something unfamiliar. Madison flipped the switch and we both stood there holding our breath, waiting to see if the light would scare him off. A few seconds later, we heard something crunch in the gravel near the side of the house, then running. Fast, heavy steps fading into the distance. We didn't go back to the bedroom. Madison grabbed the house phone and called her mom, whispering so fast it was barely English. Her mom told us to stay inside and that she was on her way. It was a 15-minute drive from the hospital, but it felt like an hour. We locked all the doors and sat on the kitchen floor with a butcher knife between us, not because we knew how to use it, but because holding something felt better than empty hands. I remember how quiet the house got. No more wind, no more TV, no more laughter. Just silence, and that horrible image burned into my head. His eyes, the way he crouched like he'd been there a while, watching. When her mom got home, she called the police right away. 2 officers showed up in separate cars, walking around the outside of the house with flashlights. They didn't find anyone, but they took it seriously. One of them even knelt by the window and said there were fresh footprints in the dirt below, deep ones, like someone had been there for a long time. They asked us to describe him, and when I mentioned the hoodie with the tear in the sleeve, one of the officers looked at the other like it rang a bell. They didn't explain much, just said there'd been reports in the area of a man peeking into windows at night and that he might be the same person. That night I stayed in the guest room with the blinds drawn tight and the closet light on. A few days later, Madison told me something that made my stomach knot. Her mom had been watering the front lawn when she found a small metal pin, like the kind you'd get at a carnival or a state fair, pushed into the dirt by the hedge near the window. None of them had ever seen it before. It had a cartoon bear on it, but it was rusted over, like it had been kept somewhere damp. A few other neighbors started reporting things too. Little objects left near windows, under porches, even on car hoods. Stuff that didn't belong to them. A keychain, a glove, an old school photo. The police came back and quietly confirmed they'd been tracking someone suspected of trespassing and stealing small items from yards. They believed he'd been collecting things, watching, returning. After that, Madison's mom had motion sensor lights installed around the house and trimmed back the hedges completely. I didn't sleep over there again for a long time, and when I finally did, we kept the bedroom light on all night and piled furniture in front of the window. The cops never caught the guy, not officially at least. But about 2 weeks later, a man was arrested a few towns over for trespassing behind a daycare center at night. He matched the description we gave almost exactly. Word spread that he had a storage unit filled with boxes of junk, souvenirs they called it, random stuff he'd taken from people's yards and porches. They never released a name to the public, and we were never asked to ID anyone. I still think about how long he might have been there before we noticed. The way he was crouched so still, so low to the ground, it's like he was waiting for the perfect moment. I can't help but wonder how many other windows he stared through, how many times he'd watched without anyone realizing. The blinds in that room weren't even fully closed. There were probably gaps he could have seen through the whole time we were laughing, eating chips, watching TV like everything was normal. That's what haunts me the most. How normal everything felt until it didn't. Years later, I still check every window before going to bed. I don't care if I'm staying in a hotel, someone's guest room, or my own place. I make sure the curtains are drawn tight and nothing is left even slightly open. People always think of home invasions as some loud, dramatic thing, like a door being kicked in. But the quiet kind, the ones where someone's already there, just watching, that's worse. It stays with you. It changes how you see your own space, your own safety. It's easy to brush things off as the wind or a trick of the light. But now I always look, even if I'm alone, even if it seems silly, because the one time I almost didn't, someone was right there, not moving, not speaking, just watching through a window, like he'd done it 100 times before. I'm 17, and honestly, I thought I'd share this because it still keeps me awake sometimes. I was staying over at my buddy Jake's place in suburban Texas, one of those quiet neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone and the biggest crime is someone not picking up their dog's mess. It was March 2018, and I was a junior in high school, spending way too much time playing Call of Duty and avoiding my chemistry homework. Jake's family had moved into this house about 8 months earlier, a nice 2-story place with a big front yard and one of those doors with the fancy glass panels. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, were the kind of people who always had snacks ready and never minded when I crashed there on weekends. Life was pretty simple back then. School, games, hanging out, repeat. The most exciting thing that had happened to me recently was getting my driver's license and finally being able to drive my dad's beat-up Ford pickup without supervision. We'd been planning this sleepover for weeks because Jake had just gotten the new FIFA game, and we were determined to play until our eyes bled. His little sister Amanda was spending the night at her friend's house, which meant we had the basement all to ourselves with the big TV and surround sound system. Jake's mom had stocked us up with frozen pizzas, energy drinks, and enough chips to feed a small army. His dad, who worked as an accountant at some boring office downtown, had given us the usual "don't stay up too late" speech before heading to bed around 10. The house had this cozy feeling to it. Thick carpets that muffled sound, warm lighting, and family photos covering every wall. Everything felt safe and normal, the way a home should feel. We settled in for what we thought would be just another typical Friday night of gaming and trash talk. The first few hours flew by in a blur of goals, celebrations, and Jake absolutely destroying me at penalties. We were being loud, probably too loud, shouting at the TV and arguing about whether that last goal was offside. Around midnight, we heard Mr. Thompson's footsteps upstairs, the creaky floorboard near the kitchen giving him away like it always did. Then we heard the front door handle jiggle, followed by the distinct sound of the deadbolt clicking into place. A few minutes later, he came down to the basement, wearing his old college t-shirt and pajama pants, with this puzzled expression on his face. "Boys," he said, scratching his head, "did either of you go outside tonight? The front door was completely unlocked when I went to check it." We both shook our heads immediately. We'd been glued to the couch since dinner, and neither of us had any reason to leave. He shrugged it off, muttering something about his wife probably forgetting to lock it after bringing in the mail, and headed back upstairs. We didn't think much of it at the time. People forget to lock doors all the time, right? Jake's mom was always getting distracted by phone calls or work emails, and it seemed like the kind of innocent mistake any busy parent would make. We cranked the volume back up and kept playing, though I noticed Jake glancing toward the stairs a few times. The basement suddenly felt a little more isolated, a little more cut off from the rest of the house. But we were 17 and stupid, and the game was too good to worry about something as mundane as a door being left unlocked. We played until about 2:30 in the morning, when exhaustion finally started to hit us. Jake passed out first, controller still in his hand, snoring softly on the sectional couch. I wasn't far behind, curled up in the recliner with a throw blanket Jake's mom had left down there. The house was completely silent except for the gentle hum of the heater and Jake's occasional snore. I'm not sure what woke me up. Maybe it was the way the silence suddenly felt heavier, or maybe it was some primal instinct that kicks in when danger is near. But around 3 a.m., my eyes snapped open, and I was instantly alert in that weird way that happens sometimes in the middle of the night. The basement was darker than before. The small nightlight in the corner seemed dimmer somehow. I could hear Jake breathing steadily beside me, still dead asleep, but there was something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floor upstairs. Not the familiar heavy tread of Mr. Thompson checking on things, but lighter steps, almost careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding as I strained to listen, wondering if maybe Mrs. Thompson had gotten up for water or something. But these footsteps had a different rhythm, a hesitant quality that made the hair on my arm stand up. The footsteps moved from what sounded like the living room toward the hallway, each step deliberate and measured. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just one of Jake's parents, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The way this person moved was wrong, too cautious, too slow, like they were unfamiliar with the house layout. Then I heard it, the soft, almost inaudible click of a door closing. Not a slam, not the casual closing of someone who belonged there, but the careful, precise sound of someone trying to be as quiet as possible. My whole body tensed up, and I wanted to wake Jake, but part of me was terrified to move or make any sound. The basement suddenly felt like a trap. We were underground with only one way out, and someone was upstairs in the house. I lay there in the darkness, listening to my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, waiting for any other sound that might give me a clue about what was happening above us. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I finally worked up the courage to reach over and shake Jake's shoulder. He groaned and tried to roll away, but I kept shaking him until his eyes opened. "Jake," I whispered, barely audible. "Someone's in your house." He looked at me like I was crazy at first, still half asleep and confused. But then he saw the terror in my eyes, and his expression changed immediately. We both lay there in complete silence for several minutes, straining to hear anything from upstairs. The house was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that feels heavy with presence rather than empty. Jake slowly sat up and grabbed his phone, his face pale in the blue light of the screen. "Should we call my dad?" he mouthed silently. I nodded and he started to dial when we heard it again. More footsteps, this time moving toward the front of the house. Then nothing. We decided we had to wake up Mr. Thompson. Jake crept up the basement stairs and I followed close behind, both of us trying to step on the edges of each stair to minimize creaking. The main floor was dark except for the glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen. Everything looked normal, but there was this strange feeling in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. We made our way to Jake's parents' bedroom, and Jake gently shook his dad awake. Mr. Thompson immediately sensed the urgency in our whispered explanations and sat up, fully alert. "Are you sure you heard someone?" he asked quietly. We both nodded, and he reached for his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said, his voice steady but serious. "You boys stay here with your mom." Mrs. Thompson had woken up during our conversation, and she pulled us both close to her side of the bed while Mr. Thompson made the call. The wait for the police felt endless, every small sound in the house making us all jump. When the officers arrived about 15 minutes later, they were thorough but skeptical. Two cops, an older guy with gray hair and a younger woman with sharp eyes, walked through every room of the house with their flashlights, checking closets, behind furniture, even the garage. They found nothing disturbed, nothing missing, no signs of forced entry. The front door was still locked, all the windows were secure, and there was no evidence that anyone had been inside. The older cop asked us to walk through exactly what we'd heard, and I could tell he was trying to be polite, but clearly thought we were just spooked teenagers with overactive imaginations. "Sometimes houses make noises," he said gently, Settling sounds, heating systems, that sort of thing. But Jake's dad wasn't buying it. He'd lived in enough houses to know the difference between settling sounds and footsteps. After the police left, we all sat in the living room with the lights on, none of us wanting to go back to sleep. Mrs. Thompson made hot chocolate, and we tried to convince ourselves that maybe the cop was right. Maybe we'd just imagined it all. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the previous night feel like a bad dream. Jake and I were both exhausted, but we helped Mrs. Thompson make breakfast and tried to laugh about how scared we'd been. Mr. Thompson, however, wasn't letting it go. He spent the morning walking around the house, checking every lock, every window, looking for any sign of how someone could have gotten in. He even called a locksmith to change the front door lock just to be safe. "Better safe than sorry," he said when his wife protested about the expense. But what really bothered him was the door lock itself. There were no scratches around the keyhole, no signs of tampering, nothing that would indicate someone had picked it or forced it open. The locksmith confirmed that the lock was in perfect condition and hadn't been damaged in any way. "If someone got in," the locksmith said, "they had to have used a key." That comment stuck with all of us, but we couldn't figure out how that was possible since the family had all their keys accounted for. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that we got our answer, and it was way worse than any of us had imagined. Mrs. Thompson was at work when she got a call from their previous landlord, the guy who owned the rental house they'd lived in before buying this place. Apparently, he'd been doing some maintenance work and found a whole drawer full of duplicate keys in his maintenance shed, including several copies of the Thompson family's old house key. When he confronted his former maintenance worker, a guy named Vincent who'd been fired 6 months earlier for showing up to work drunk, the man broke down and confessed everything. Vincent had been making copies of tenant keys for years, keeping them even after families moved out. He'd been using the Thompsons' key to break into their new house at least 3 times over the past few months, just walking around, looking through their stuff, maybe taking small things they wouldn't notice. The night Jake and I heard him was supposed to be his last visit. He'd planned to take Mrs. Thompson's jewelry box from their bedroom, but our voices from the basement had spooked him, and he'd left empty-handed. The police arrested Vincent that same day, and they found a whole collection of keys and stolen items in his apartment. Turns out, he'd been doing this to multiple families, always careful never to take anything too valuable or obvious, just small things that people might misplace naturally. The most disturbing part was that he'd been in the Thompson house while they were sleeping at least twice before, just wandering around like he owned the place. Mr. Thompson was furious, not just at Vincent, but at himself for not taking our concerns more seriously initially. The family ended up installing a full security system and changing every lock in the house, even though the danger was over. As for me, I learned that sometimes the scariest monsters are just regular people who've convinced themselves they have the right to invade your safe space. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what would have happened if Vincent had been more bold, or if we hadn't woken up. It's a reminder that the real world can be just as terrifying as any horror movie, maybe even more so because it's completely, disturbingly real.